recap for you a little bit what we talked about last week, and then I want to have maybe more of a practical discussion through these things. So we covered verse 4. That was it. Verse 4. I'm going to read the first 4 verses, and then we'll zero back in on verse 4 and chat about it a little bit. So this is Isaiah's second vision. It says, the vision that Isaiah son of Amoz saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains, and it will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it, and many people will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways so that we may walk in his path. For instruction will go out of Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will settle disputes among the nations. He will provide arbitration for many peoples, and they will turn their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives. Nations will not take up the sword against other nations, and they will never again train for war. So last week, let me just give you a recap here. What we talked about was the fact that clearly in verse 2, we see that this says it's in the last days, right? So we have a picture here. Most people you may agree at what part of or disagree about what part of the last days. Is this the millennium? Is it a different age like the millennium? Or does this actually come to pass before Jesus returns? There's some of that we could wrestle around with. But when we let the text say what it says, it clearly says it's in the last days. So we know that there's a picture here that Isaiah is getting, especially as we establish that the first part of those verses, 2 and 3, clearly are pointing to the Great Commission, right? We kind of established that. So there really isn't a disconnect in verse 4. As you just work down through it, this is the vision that he sees. There's instruction going out of Zion. There's the people desiring to come in and to follow the God of Jacob, as Yahweh is exalted above all the other gods, above all the other worldviews, and things like that. And verse 4 is kind of the results of that. It seems like what he is saying here is that as people learn the way of Christ, as they learn the way of Jesus, as they seek Yahweh, that the Lord, through his people, begins to settle disputes among the nations. They provide arbitration and discernment, and they settle disagreements among the peoples. And it says then the people turn their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives, and they learn not to war anymore. And so last week what we talked about was the emphasis of peace in the New Testament. Okay, that's what I focused on. Is I wanted to leave some of you guys with something pretty heavy to chew on when it comes to the emphasis of peace that we're given in this picture, and that we also see that particularly the New Testament and the early church, the weight that they put on what Jesus meant to the world. And particularly when it comes to the area of peace. And so I gave you guys some quotes last week. I quoted some pretty heavy things about the early church fathers. The first 300 years of the church were pretty much unanimous that the church believed that they were to be the ones that taught the world how to not war. And this is why you largely see them being martyred, and they never raised a sword against anyone else. They never fought back against anyone else. They never took up grievance. They never avenged themselves against anyone. And this was unanimous. This was so unanimous. Some of the quotes that I read said they used to exclude anybody from joining the church if they were in the military. That's a church reality for the first almost 300 years in the early church. I'm not saying that's necessarily my position, but I did want to leave you to wrestle with that a little bit. Because Tertullian in the first century said, and this was a quote I read last week, when Jesus put away Peter's sword, he put away every Christian sword. By extension, he put away everyone's sword. Because if anybody had a chance to rebel and to fight back, It would have been when they took the Lord and Peter was standing up for him, right? And yet Jesus rebukes him and tells him to put it away. And the early church took that very, very seriously. And I would say there's a large amount of the church. I think people do take that seriously, but I did want you to wrestle with, do you take it seriously enough? The kind of radical peace and love for enemy and love for neighbor that we are called to have as the people of God. Go ahead.
I was going to ask if you could repeat that. What did they not permit?
Some of the, well, yeah, I have some quotes. Sorry, let me just read some of these to you. Okay, so for instance, within the first 200 years of the church, it says, 4 writers, particularly, I'm reading this again because it's about Isaiah. This is why this came up. 4 early church fathers, 4 writers in 8 different works strongly imply that Christians should not join the military. And at least 8 times, 5 different authors apply this messianic prophecy from Isaiah 2:4 about the swords being beaten into plowshares to Christ and his teachings. So the early church looked at Isaiah and said, this is fulfilled in our day. This is what's going on. We live in the last times. The disciples were teaching it. You go through James, you go through Peter, you go through the book of Hebrews. It's saying we live in the last time. So the early church looked at this prophecy in Isaiah and they said, we're to teach the world not to war. Part of our mission is to take swords, which are instruments of war, and to turn them into plows. So we're to get rid of our instruments of war and we're to turn them into instruments of production. We're to bless the world and benefit the world, not kill it. If that makes sense, And so, I'll give you a couple of these. Origen, if you know the church father Origen, they were asking him about war, and he said, well, Christ forbade the killing of anyone, and all wars would end if the Romans would just become Christians. That was his quote. They said, well, why don't you fight? And he goes, well, the wars would end if you all just became Christians. That was his answer. His answer wasn't, let's go kill the enemies and then we'll get them all on our side. It was, well, if you guys would become Christians, everything would stop. Hippolytus, which is another, Hippolytus has some of the writings. I don't want to take too long on this, but he has the second earliest extra biblical writing. So there's the Didache, and then there's some epistles. There's the epistles of Clement and things, but Hippolytus is another one. And what Hippolytus said, any soldier who wants to be catechized must be told not to kill and must refuse to kill if ordered to do so. If a soldier acts otherwise, he must be excluded from communion. Somebody who is already a Christian who then seeks to join the military should be excluded from the church. There was more wrestling on this topic, okay? So that's why I only got to give these quotes last week, and then we were done. And I was like, boy, I left you guys with cliffhangers. I didn't give any kind of discussion or anything like that. But there is a sense where I do want you to wrestle with that. And Jared asked the question about Isaiah. He said, well, is that descriptive or is it prescriptive? Is that picture we get from Isaiah, is it prescribing something from us? Do we literally have to take our swords and our guns and our instruments of war and get rid of them and turn them into means of production, and that's all we're supposed to have? One, I told him, that is descriptive. This is a picture of what Isaiah is seeing. But when you search the New Testament, when you get into, read the Sermon on the Mount sometime. I would encourage you, as we're going through Isaiah, read the Sermon on the Mount. We brought this up a couple times, particularly with Isaiah 2. Read the prescriptive answers that Jesus gives to those who are wronged, to those who are being slapped across the face, to those who are being oppressed by a tyrannical ruler. and being told to give of their cloak or carry a bag or do whatever. Read the instructions that he gives to how we are to overcome evil. You guys tell me, how are we supposed to overcome evil?
By doing good.
By doing good. If you go to Romans chapter 12, Paul pretty much quotes the entire thing. He says, make sure you do not repay evil for evil, but overcome evil with good. Peter, similarly, and I talked last week about the emphasis of peace, Peter quotes Psalm 34, where he says, if you want to live a good life and see long days, he says, keep yourself from evil and your lips from speaking lies. Turn from evil, do good, seek peace, and pursue it. So that means we actively have to be going after peace and not just seeking it. So we're looking for peace, right? We're looking for it. And then it says we're pursuing it. So when we see an avenue for peace, we need to pursue that peace. And that's on our shoulders. That's not, if this person comes to me and says they're sorry, I'm going to forgive them. You know what I mean? No, it says you seek peace, you pursue it. And Paul takes that in Romans and says, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with all people. As much as you can, live at peace with all people. So I do want to have a twofold practical discussion, a little bit here, before we wrap up or as we're wrapping up. One thing, I want to hear from you a little bit, maybe some of your questions, concerns about, as you're wrestling with some of these thoughts, of the picture of radical peace that I gave to you, that I do believe the scriptures call us to in the New Testament. We just got done 2 Corinthians, and do you remember what the theme of the new covenant in 2 Corinthians was? Our covenant is more glorious than the old one. The old one, there was a lot of warring, right? The old covenant, there was bloodshed. The old covering was conquering in a physical sense, in a taking of the land. But do any of you know why David was not allowed to build the temple? Because
He had blood on his hands.
Because he was a man of war. He was a man of bloodshed, interestingly enough. And Solomon, which literally means peace, is the one who builds the temple. This discussion goes pretty deep. But what are some things you're thinking of over that in particular? What are some stuff that hits to you? Rob and I had a conversation afterwards last time, because Rob said, man, I work for the military, you know? Is that something I shouldn't? Because there's certain places in the church where they say, you can't feed the system at all. And correct me if I'm wrong, maybe Matt, you know this. I know I've talked to, I think it was Mennonites or Amish, where they won't even work or be contracted by the military, because to them it's all the beast. Yeah, they will have, if they're building a building for the military, they're like, I'm out, because I'm not going to contribute at all to the machine. That's to them, that's the war machine, right? So what do you think about that? I mean, me and Rob talked, but what do you guys think about that? Yeah, go ahead.
I had a discussion with one of the dads on Ronan's team, who I know is Christian, and it seems like there's two categories, I guess. One where you're like warring, or there's some persecution, or like it's not, and then there's like the direct assault on your personhood or your family's personhood, and it's like super personal. And I think it was kind of like, well, yeah, I can understand like we kind of talked about pacifism and just war, and he's like, I don't know if I agree with either one of those blanket.
Yeah.
And I said, what about, if it were to come to your home or whatever, like how would you respond to that? And he's like, that, and to me, same way, it gets dicey.
Yeah.
Where, and again, this comes out of the feeling, right? Like, to me, it feels wrong to knowingly let harm come to other people that I am perfectly capable of physically protecting.
Yeah.
Like, while we're here on Earth, obviously, spiritual warfare and being spiritually active and concerned with the matters not of this world. That's important, but you can't just. I think there was something in just at the end of 2 Corinthians, wasn't there? Don't do nothing. Don't be like these people that are just like, oh, the end of the world is coming. You got to do something. And so we're in this world where sometimes we have to take action. You know, I don't think that there's anybody. No.
So then, go ahead.
I think so. I think there's a lot of people who'd say I would defend, but I would never attack. You know,
Okay. All right. So let me give you another quote that I said last week, and then Justice, I'll get to you. So Athanasius, who was in the 3rd century, Athanasius said, Christians, instead of arming themselves with swords, extend their hands in prayer. So his take on this, you said we don't do nothing. I would agree. First off, we don't do nothing. But Athanasius says instead of extending a sword, you extend your hand in prayer. So that's something to put in there. I'll add more too. I want you to think. I got my opinions, trust me. But I did. But thank you. Yeah.
Isn't there a verse where if you kill with a sword, you're going to die with a sword?
Yeah, I mean, that is what Jesus said. Peter, put away your sword. And he said, if you live by the sword, you die by the sword.
So my thing is Peter had a sword, right?
Yeah.
You know, and I'm assuming all the apostles would have to defend in any circumstance. So the intent to kill, you know, that'd be something different. But for me personally, if someone came into my household, I'm not going to shoot them because I want to. That's not even going to be my first option. But then you think of it this way, you know, there was a group of ladies back like 6-7 years ago that 2 black guys, no offense to them, but that's what they were. 2 black guys broke into their house and went in there to kill them, and they just started shouting out, Jesus,
Yeah.
Jesus, and the guys freaked out. They had no clue what was going on, and they went.
Yeah.
But then you also, there's this pastor, I don't remember his name, but he said, you know, Jesus said to turn the other cheek. But you don't got that many cheeks to turn. So when do you eventually start? Like, when do you start coming back? So I personally believe in the fight, but I also don't believe in the intent to do it. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to harm anyone in my life.
Yeah.
Ever. It happens, but I don't want it to happen.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Anybody else got any thoughts? So we see like a defense. I think these are natural reactions too. That's why I think this is a tough issue, because there is clearly even God over his people, right? God protects his people. So there's this natural instinct being made in the image of God that we have this desire to protect our wives. I mean, we're called to be protectors, right? So again, I don't think that's by accident, you know what I mean? So that's where, as you wrestle with some of this stuff, we do have to ask what this means. But what I don't want you to do, though, is where you land on this, I think you need to dwell in unity and harmony with your brothers who maybe dwell in a different place than you, because let me tell you this, if you're really strongly convicted that I'm a man, and if somebody breaks into my house, I would just kill them dead because I'm protecting my family, and that is the biblical right thing to do, you've got to wrestle with a lot of really godly people throughout time that they just believed that their life in heaven was greater than their life on earth, and if somebody was going to break in and take it, they were going to lay it down. You know what I mean? And to be honest with you, I would ask you the question, which one of y'all has more faith in that scenario? I'm not saying that's easy, and because the gut reaction is to protect. But I love that you brought up some of those stories, because, listen, a lot of times the first knee-jerk reaction is the hypothetical. Well, what if somebody breaks into your house and they come after your kids? The reality is that happens for a fraction of a percent of people. Like, the vast majority of people will never, ever experience something like that in your life. Yeah. No, Matt, yours was up first, but go ahead.
My defense to that would be, do you have a security system?
Yeah.
Do you have security lights? You know.
There's multiple steps. Do you have a dog? You know, and I don't have a dog, but like even getting a dog is like an amazing thing for home defense and things like that. And it's it's not for the dog. It takes you out of the equation of it being non-violent. You know what I mean? It can be violent for the dog, man. That's.
But you just became an accomplice.
A dog can be violent, and a dog is harder to control.
I was just gonna say, listen, y'all came into my house. I didn't become an accomplice. You came into my house. Like, that's your problem.
It's called for you.
Right. Yeah.
It's already a
But that's the one thing, because when you go into this, everybody goes to those extreme examples. And the reality is that's a very, very small fraction of the things. Okay? If we chalk those up to, one, I think you should prepare and mull these things over in your heart and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, we can't discount, because for every time someone pulls the trigger on something like that, I mean, with the internet today, it's cool that you can actually look these up. There are scenarios over and over and over again of somebody getting their car jacked and the person singing hymns in the back seat or something, and they were going to kill them, and they just let them go, and they just get up and leave. And it's like, isn't that a step of faith though too? Isn't that a sword? Isn't that a weapon when we trust God enough with our own lives to go, the Lord, I'm going to worship you, I'm going to praise you in Jesus' name. Stop this going on right now. I ain't stopping it. You said vengeance is yours and I'm not to repay, so it's on you, Lord. If it's my time to go, it's my time to go. If it's not, you stop them, right? I think that's an act of faith too. But let me go one more step, because I do want to add a little bit into this as well. Jared brought up the term a pacifist or passivity. I would consider myself, I don't say I'm a pacifist, because I think that term is weighted. I think it's unhelpful, because people associate passiveness with passivity, as in do nothing. And if you remember in the garden, I just pointed at you because you brought it up. If you remember in the garden, when they came after Jesus, do you remember they're looking for Jesus? What does Jesus do? What's the first thing he does? What?
Doesn't he tell them where he is?
He steps up and he tells them where he is. And what happens to, these are Roman soldiers, like the equivalent of Navy SEALs today. What happens to the Roman soldiers? They all fall over. I truly believe in my heart of hearts, Jesus exercised a form of force against them on the spiritual realm that was intimidating to them, and that's why the soldiers let the rest of the disciples go. Because it was a legion of soldiers. They could have gathered all the disciples up right then. They could have got them all, tried them all, done it all. But when they all were shocked and they were all pushed back by Jesus's words, I think it intimidated them to the point where Jesus, in a sense, defended those he loved. He didn't kill them. He didn't stop them from getting him or doing whatever. Jesus laid his own life down, but he protected the ones that were with him, the ones that were to get away, and he wanted to keep safe. Were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, in Luke, before, at the end of Jesus' ministry,
Yeah.
he actually had them bring a sword. That's how.
So that's a common objection, right?
But that was just to fulfill,
right.
I think for him to make his point.
Yeah, so a lot of people bring that up and they say, well, Jesus told his disciples, sell your cloak and bring a sword. And I say, keep reading, because it says this was to fulfill what it was said in Isaiah, I think, that he was numbered among the transgressors. Jesus told it, because that would have meant that 2 of them had swords. 2 swords for 12 people was not very much. But it was that one sword that Peter uses, and Jesus tells him to put it away. So that, again, this is all very interesting in the context of what we're talking about here. But again, the purpose of that sword was so that he would be tried as an insurrectionist. There's a very clear reason Jesus said to sell your cloak and get a sword. It wasn't for self-protection, because when Peter used it for self-protection, Jesus told him to put it away. It was to have that prophecy fulfilled. So that's one argument when people say, well, you know, Jesus said sell your cloak and get a sword, therefore you can shoot somebody. Well, no, that's not what he meant. That's not the context. Slice. Yeah. I was applying it in a modern day. Now, let me go I will, because, and I know we're you know, I don't want to go too long with all this stuff. But I do want to help you. One, I think what Rob and I talked about when it came to the military, I don't care what this is, whether it's the military, whether it's the governmental position, whether it's you're at your job, Daniel, your job, Matt, you're building something. There's a clear principle in Scripture that whatever you're doing for this world, you need to be able to do it in faith and as a Christian. And so that's between you and the Lord. And so just like one of the quotes that I read here, he said, if you were in the military, the next thing you need to do is you have to live like a Christian in the military. If you're being called to compromise your values at work, whether it be the military, whether it be as a builder, whether it be as even a housewife or whatever, it doesn't matter. Whatever you do, you can't compromise what is true and what is right and what is moral, right? You have to live like a Christian everywhere you are. And so as you see this getting worked out in church history, that's the overwhelming position that you start to see is they work to a place where they go, well, it's not necessarily wrong for a Christian to be in the military or contribute to the military, but in the military, they have to still act like a Christian. And then there was still a divide, and there's still a divide to this day, over can a Christian kill in good faith or can they not? That's an argument. That's something people still struggle with today. I've wrestled with it so much that I chalk it a little bit up to conscience, because I just think, man, it's for certain scenarios, it's a toughie. In a scenario, and this is why. So I couldn't, because of the things we talked about, even if I'm personally convicted that I would not kill another human being. If someone broke into your house and was grabbing your wife and you defended your wife in faith, godly, to stop this person and for love for your wife, I go, who am I to say that that's not right before the Lord? You know what I mean? Like, if you did that in faith, you did it to as much as you can to please God as your role of husband and to love your neighbor, and it wasn't your first line of defense to go shooting them up, right? You know what I mean? Like, you've wrestled with this and you just acted and you did what you need. One, if it was sin and you felt like it was sin, there is forgiveness there too. And I'm not saying that to be light about it. I'm saying genuinely. God gives concessions for us. Point in case, in the Old Testament, it says if somebody breaks into your house at night and you shoot them, or it didn't say shoot them. If you kill them, you're not guilty of bloodshed. But if it's daylight and you can see them and you kill them, you were guilty of bloodshed. Why? Because you could discern the intention. At nighttime, it was a concession for God to say, you didn't know why they were there. You reacted and you killed them. You're not guilty of the bloodshed. If you could see them, if you knew, if there was a different route you could have taken, and in spite of that you killed them anyway, then it's on you. I don't think God changed. Well, I know He doesn't change, so I have to understand that He understands us in our weaknesses. Even if you say it was in my weakness that I just didn't have enough faith and I protected my wife. I didn't pray, I shot. Well, the Lord can overcome that, right? The Lord is great in our weaknesses. I'm not saying to take that lightly. I'm not saying you should just do that and go ask for forgiveness later. No, I'm not saying that. But I am saying the reality of don't beat yourself up over this stuff, because listen, I don't care how much you train, we all still would react in a situation like that. Man, sometimes you just go on instincts and things happen, right? So I don't want anybody to beat themselves up too much over that stuff. But at the same time, I also want you to mull over this and to think about this. Because I think it's really important, the testimony that we give to the world. And that's what's clear in these verses in Isaiah. As I wrap this up a little bit more, in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, 3 and 4, what's very clear here is that through God's people, through the followers of Jesus, the world learns to live in a different way. That's what's clear. The main point, and this is specifically, it's talking about peace, but it's also talking about instruction. Clearly, the world is learning how to solve their disputes, to make judgments by watching and learning from God's people. And so we need to be very careful about the way we walk. We need to be very careful, not just about how we treat others, but how we're teaching people to treat others. When I did a podcast on this a couple years ago with some pastor friends of mine, and they said, you'll not believe it, it was this week. They minister up in the Massachusetts area, and they're in downtown Boston area, and they minister in the parks and with gangs and stuff. And they're what they call Christian nonviolent. They believe in Christian nonviolence, which is what I said. I don't use the term pacifist. I believe in Christian nonviolence. And there was a gang fight that broke out right where they were doing a Bible study. And they just boldly got up, the two pastors, and walked over and said, do you not know that Jesus says this is not how we're supposed to act? You guys need to stop what you're doing in the name of Jesus, because you're to turn the other cheek and you're to seek peace. And he goes, wouldn't you believe it? They stopped. And he goes, why is that not our first reaction? Because most of the time we respond in the flesh, not in the spirit. And he goes, but it was such a testimony to them of the power of God. And then he goes right away, he said, why don't you guys come join us in the Bible study? He said half of them came over and sat down and they joined the Bible study. Behold the power of God. You know what I mean? Like literally. And so I think we need to take this kind of stuff pretty seriously. And then my second thing, is I think we need to look, when it does say that we take those swords and those instruments of war and we turn them into plowshares or plows and pruning hooks, it is saying we're teaching the world about productivity. And I think as God's people, we need to be a productive people. We need to be building and shaping. And if you look back in history, that's what God's people always have been. All the sciences were advanced by Christians. All the hospitals, Christians. All the education institution, Christians. All the inventions and different things that advanced technology, Christians. We have such a rich heritage and we need to continue it. Now is not the time to just pack it in and go, it's getting so bad, the Lord's coming. I'm just going to wait it out. You know what Paul told those people in his day? If you don't work, you don't eat. Don't just go around with your hands in the air going, oh, just come, Lord. Yes, say, come, Lord Jesus. I'm not telling you don't say, and don't anticipate, and don't look forward to his coming. Yes. But while you're here, get your butt in gear. Build, plant, work, create a legacy, start businesses, help each other, impact your community, run for office, do some stuff with the education. You know what I mean? We're the producers. If we don't do it, it goes crazy. Because clearly, and Rob, I will get to you, clearly according to these verses, the world is to learn from us. We're not to learn from the world. We're to influence the world. They learn how to be peaceful and how to be productive from us. Rob, go ahead.
What you said earlier about it's getting bad. We need to wait for the Lord to come back. Like, if you think about the parable of the talents. That reaction is burying your talent in the sand and waiting for the master to come back.
Yeah.
And you know what his answer is to that.
Yeah.
And I think too, with the war thing and is war okay and what should we think about it? But just for sake of argument, replace the word war with sin. As Christians, we don't have the luxury of running away from being around sinful activity. In fact, we're supposed to be in the thick of it. That's where our work is. So, but the thing about sin, though, and the Bible tells us this, is where there's sin, God provides the way out.
Right.
So let's train ourselves. First of all, I think we can at least accept that for now, things like this will happen. Train ourselves to look for the way out and seek it and pursue it.
Yeah.
I think that's a lot of what pursuing peace is.
Yeah, and I want us to have more discussions on this. Like always, any of these issues when they come up, as we're working through them, talk with one another about this. Talk to me, talk to your brothers, talk to your sisters, because we're working through the scriptures together and we need to encourage each other and build each other up in these things. I've wrestled with a lot of these things. I'm sure you guys have wrestled with stuff. We make each other better. We sharpen each other on these things, right? You know, so we got to be doing that. And there's plenty of examples. I mean, you look for, I know it became popular a handful of years ago, but the story of Desmond Doss, if you know who he is, the guy from, Hacksaw Ridge, they made a movie about him, he was in the military as a, now he was a Jehovah's Witness, but as a Christian, which I would not call them Christian, I put that in quotes for a reason, just so you know, but he refused to pick up a gun. And I mean, the Lord uses sinners, so even if we say he wasn't a Christian, the Lord used that. And he was an incredible testimony to people, and he was somebody seemingly he was really protected. There was multiple times, I don't know the guy's heart, so maybe he was, put that aside. He was somebody who was a soldier in the military who never gave up his convictions that he has as a Christian. So you can do it. You can do it, right? And he showed people how to live in peace. And he bound up those who were sick and those who were hurting. He went where nobody else wanted to go. He went on missions nobody else would go through. Yeah, so it's pretty cool stuff. All right, is that good for today? All right, was that helpful too, to kind of dig a little bit more into that from somebody? Okay, good. Well, let's pray about these things and let's hang out if you want. Father, thank you so much for your word, and thanks for this ongoing discussion we were able to have today over your word. And God, I know we want to take your word really seriously, and if you've given a prophet a picture, and you've given us a picture by extension, and you've given your church teaching over these things, I don't want us to take it really lightly. I really want us to wrestle with these things, and I want our lives and our hearts to be shaped in accordance to your words. And I want to take very serious your call, 1, for faith, 2, for radical obedience, 3, for peace, and 4, that we would be making disciples of all nations. Like we would literally see our lives as the vehicle that you are using to change the world. Lord, let that sit in our heart. That as we walk in obedience, we can change ourselves, our families, our communities, our nation, and the world. Because you have all the authority and all the power and all the glory, and you've told us to go make disciples of all nations. And to proclaim your word and your teaching everywhere, to the ends of the earth. And so, Lord, may your word go forth, and may we be your ambassadors, and may you give us the boldness and the faith that we need to accomplish your mission. Amen.